An international model, once a finalist in the Miss Switzerland pageant, is strangled to death, dismembered with a jigsaw, and then allegedly pureed in a blender. And prosecutors say they already know who did it: her husband. This is the story of 38-year-old Kristina Joksimovic and the case against her husband and the father of her two kids. Kristina's story takes us to Switzerland, where she lived and worked as a model and later a coach. In 2003, she won the Miss Northwest Switzerland pageant, and by 2008, she was a finalist in the Miss Switzerland competition. She later founded her own business called Catwalk Coach, where she transitioned to a coaching role and mentored aspiring young models.
My name is Kristina, the Catwalk Coach, and I'm preparing Natalie for her big show. Let's start with the first pose. If you want to look confident and sexy, take a step aside, turn and lean back slightly. If you're wearing a dress, take one step ahead, lean back to highlight your leg.
As her career took off, so too did her personal life, and in 2017, Kristina got married. Her husband is this guy, who's only being identified as Thomas in news outlets. Together, Kristina and Thomas shared two daughters. They lived in Binningen, Switzerland, a relatively small municipality just outside the larger city of Basel. All this is in the northwest corner of Switzerland, not far from the French or German borders. And it was this same location, the family home in Binningen, where Kristina was brutally murdered. Her body was found on February 13th, and right away, Swiss investigators knew her death was grisly. Here's a warning, the next description is pretty graphic. Detectives were able to determine that Kristina had been strangled to death, and after that, her body was dismembered. They say the suspect used multiple items to cut up her body, including a knife, garden shears, and even a jigsaw. If that wasn't enough, the suspect later took pieces of Kristina's body and ground them up with a hand blender. According to court documents, she was pureed, and the remains were left in a chemical solution to dissolve. One day after Kristina's remains were discovered, Thomas was arrested. Right away, he told investigators an interesting story, that he'd found Kristina dead in their home back in January and then panicked. Instead of calling police, he said he decided to cut up the body in their laundry room. It's important to note that both medical investigators and crime scene techs determined that the facts in Thomas's confession didn't quite add up. But that was just his initial story. In March, Thomas changed his tune, saying he killed Kristina, but it was out of self-defense because she was coming at him and he feared for his life. Thomas says Kristina had previously attacked him with a knife, but others say it was Thomas who had a history of attacking Kristina. As investigators dug more into the couple's past, witnesses revealed they'd seen Thomas violently push Kristina up against a wall, holding her by her neck. He'd apparently strangled her in the past, too. So Thomas has been in custody since his arrest, but he did appeal for release just this Wednesday. A federal court later denied that request. But during the court hearing, we learned more gruesome details about Kristina's murder and Thomas's state of mind. Officials say he showed a, quote, noticeably high level of criminal energy, lack of empathy, and cold-bloodedness after killing his wife. They also said he showed a, quote, conspicuously high level of criminal energy in an assessment, but also that there are concrete indications of mental illness. There are so many layers to this disturbing case, so we sat down with attorney Jennifer Roman to try and make sense of the crime. We know that the victim here, Kristina, had been strangled, and just that alone is terrifying and disturbing, and the fact that it's such an intimate way to die, it doesn't happen instantaneously. Does that add at all to the defendant in this case, the fact that he chose to strangle rather than shoot or stab?
This was a very intimate crime, and to the extent that the defendant is going to be claiming maybe not guilty by reason of insanity or try to allege that he had some mental health issues that might mitigate what he's accused of doing, the fact that she died by strangulation is going to completely negate any of that. And that's simply because when we think about when people are successful with being found not guilty by reason of insanity, first of all, it's really rare that somebody's successful with that defense. But second of all, we tend to think that when somebody's had a period of time to premeditate it, or that a crime took a significantly long period of time, so strangling somebody to death is not instantaneous, then cutting up their body is not instantaneous, then taking the body parts and putting them in a blender, all of that takes time and takes a certain level of cognition and ability to execute on some really disgusting and horrible actions. And all of those factors, from a jury's perspective, are going to say to the jury, he's not guilty by reason of insanity, because if he had a moment of insanity at any point along that multiple hour commission of the crime, he could have stopped. And he could have, and then after the fact, when his initial interview with the police, he says, well, I killed her, but it was in self-defense. Again, that shows an awareness of right and wrong. That mitigates and eliminates a not guilty by reason of insanity defense. So the nature of the crime, to the extent that he's going to claim not guilty by reason of insanity, which there are some intimations that that might be what he plans on alleging, to the extent that he does allege that, the facts don't support it, and the likelihood of success for him on a not guilty by reason of insanity defense are probably little to none.
I mean, you brought up a really good point. The strangulation itself is terrifying and just terrible that we even have to talk about. But this defendant took it to another level in dismembering the body in such a gruesome way. And unfortunately, this is a type of story I've covered before. It's not super common, but I have seen dismemberment stories. However, I've never seen a story where they use a jigsaw. To me, that sounds almost like the movie Saw, and then a blender. So, I mean, dismembering a body is just terrible unto itself. But I almost feel like that, what he chose to use, brings it to another level of grotesque. What do you think?
This is, I mean, to me, this is like beyond grotesque. And I think, yes, we've seen dismemberment cases before. We have the Brian Walsh case in Massachusetts right now, where he's accused of killing and dismembering his wife. But when you start to take it to the nature of the tools that were used, which is not going to be quick by any stretch of the imagination, and then you take it to the next level of physically moving those body parts, not disposing of them, but putting them into a blender, pureeing them with chemicals, there's a lot of intent and premeditation that goes into that, that it just speaks volumes about the nature of the crime, that the level of hostility, which seems like not a strong enough word for what happened here. It really is incredibly violent and feels incredibly invasive on a lot of levels.
You brought up a good point in all of that. So, after he first strangles his wife, allegedly at this point, then cuts up her body and puts her in a blender, at the very end of all this, he puts the remains in a chemical solution, which to me gets thinking consciousness of guilt. Maybe at this point he's trying to cover up his tracks. What do you think about that part?
Yes, there's definitely evidence of consciousness of guilt. I mean, it starts with his initial reports to the police, where he says she had tried to attack me with a knife. I acted in self-defense, and then I panicked, so I dismembered her body. So it starts there, where he's setting it up as I dismembered her. I didn't kill her. I killed her in self-defense, but then I sort of panicked. Then it goes on to the level of dismemberment, which is another level of concealment, and then a third level of concealment of trying to grind up those body parts and dissolve them in some sort of a chemical solution. So there are multiple levels of him attempting to conceal this alleged crime.
And you keep bringing up something really important in this case, the fact that he confessed to the crime. But there's kind of a couple of layers that have to do with it. At first, when her body's found back in February, he says, I found her dead in January. She already had died, and then I cut up the body. So he's only claiming he cut up the body. Then later, what you pointed out, he says that it was in self-defense, that she was coming at him, so he killed her with the knife. I mean, do either of these things hold up? The fact that he confessed in some way twice, is this something that's really strong for the prosecution?
The nature of the confession, both of them are particularly compelling for the prosecution, assuming that they were obtained in a legal manner and he was availed of his rights and what have you. But the nature of the confessions themselves, either one of them, are compelling. I think what becomes an extra sword for the prosecution, so to speak, is that he confessed twice and changed his story. The changing of the story goes back to that idea of attempting to conceal a crime, or a consciousness of guilt, which, again, if there's an allegation of mental health issues with him that caused him to do this rather than his own right mind, that's going to negate those claims by the defense as well. So there's multiple ways that the prosecution can use these alleged confessions from him. They can use it as part of their case in chief, and they can also use it to rebut or refute anything that the defense tries to put out there to suggest that either it was a crime of passion or it was due to some type of temporary insanity where he didn't understand right from wrong.
The details of Kristina's case are particularly tragic and honestly really hard to talk about. But she does deserve to have her story told. And one of the reasons we're able to do that is because of our sponsors, like Odoo. Odoo is a free all-in-one business management software that provides you with a range of applications that help with the day-to-day of owning a business. That's things like managing PTO, customer relations, or even different subscriptions. Now here's the kicker. You can try Odoo for free right now without even entering your credit card. You can even get free lifetime access to one of the apps in the Odoo suites. All you have to do is click our link, odoo.com/lcnews in the description and pinned comments, and try Odoo for free right now. There's also a major point the prosecution will want to hit on: Thomas's alleged past history with domestic violence. If we're taking a look at the second confession, the one where he said it was self-defense, what's interesting to me about this is there had been prior reports of him being aggressive with her. I guess a different witness had said he saw the husband take Kristina, put her up against the wall, kind of strangle her in front of multiple people. That gets me thinking about prior bad acts. So what would it take to include that in the case in chief when it comes time for trial?
So this is a little bit technical because I don't know what Switzerland's rules of evidence are in terms of admitting the admission of prior bad acts. But in a situation in the United States, a defendant's prior bad acts may be admitted into evidence if the court finds that they are instructive but not unduly prejudicial to the defendant. So the fact that other people saw him demonstrate violence towards the victim is going to be compelling evidence. And the fact that the nature of the alleged violence, the banging her head, strangulation, is very similar to what he's accused of doing now, is going to become a balancing test, right? I think that a fact finder does need to hear that there was a pattern of physical abuse or allegations of physical abuse. In fact, there are claims that the police had been called to the house before to investigate allegations of domestic violence. So this wasn't an isolated incident. And so certainly the prosecution is going to push really hard to have that testimony come in and to have prior bad acts come in to show a pattern, to show that this was escalating, that this was very much intentional and premeditated and not the result of a crime of passion, or to refute a self-defense claim, that the defense might try to raise in this case. So they're definitely going to push to get it in. I think the question is, what do the rules of evidence allow for in Switzerland courts? Certainly here it could be admissible.
We've talked about what led up to the murder, these prior bad acts, then the gruesome details of the murder, but now I want to focus on what happened afterward. So we talk about these multiple confessions, but additionally, according to the reports I've seen, some of the investigators said he completely lacked empathy. I mean, he's talking in both confessions about chopping up his wife and doesn't have any empathy about what he's done that he confessed to. Additionally, I've seen some reports that say he had sadistic or sociopathic traits, that he was kind of expressing all of those things. So is his reaction at the end of this crime, let's say after he's been taken into custody, does any of that matter in terms of the trial?
Certainly investigators are going to be able to testify as to his demeanor and to how he presented their observations of him when they were questioning him, when he was making these alleged confessions. It's all going to be relevant to his state of mind. I think right now, with what we have of these characterizations of sociopathic and lack of empathy, and I think one of the allegations was that he had a high level of criminal activity. I don't know what any of those things actually mean. So it's really going to come down to what are the details that support those things, right? What was the defendant saying? How was he saying it? Did he show any emotion about the loss of his wife under these horrible, horrific circumstances? Was there any indication of the loss that his children might be suffering? They have two young children together. Was there any awareness or concern about them in this process? And certainly, if the defendant is demonstrating a lack of concern for any of those factors, then it is going to support the prosecution's theory that he was so cold-hearted that he could actually commit this crime. Because I think an average person says, "How could somebody do this to somebody? This is just beyond reality, much less the mother of your children." And so the prosecution, I think, is going to have to sort of develop the defendant in a way that shows that he was capable of it, that this lack of empathy, this lack of emotion, this sociopathic tendencies or sadistic comments and remarks, those are all going to build the prosecution's case about how he could do this, how he could actually execute on such a horrible, horrific crime.
And we touched on this a bit earlier, but I kind of want to bring it back to this, the mental health component, all of it. You mentioned his state of mind during the crime, which is going to be very important. And it's kind of an underlying theme to all of this. I mean, this is not a natural crime by any stretch of the imagination. So automatically it gets us thinking, is this person mentally ill to have willingly committed these things? I know that you had said previously we don't think that's really going to hold up, but if the defense does try to go this route, how would they go about that?
If the defense is seeking to base their defense in whole or in part on his inability to decide right from wrong in the moment, or they're going to say he had voices in his head that he was compelled to do this, he thought he was saving her, he thought he was saving the children, we don't really know. But if it's some sort of allegation that his mental health was not right, that caused him to do this, and that if he was in his right mind, he would have never done this, the defense is going to have to lay the groundwork for that. Usually what we see is a pattern of psychiatric treatment and care. Sometimes we see psychiatric hospitalizations. We hear about a history of significant trauma in the defendant's life that may lead to a split personality or a dissociative disorder where they disengage from their body, their mental side disengages from their body. They would need to present evidence that shows there's sort of been this pattern of mental health disorders. If there's a history of mental health disorders but have not been treated or diagnosed, the defense is going to have a much harder time selling that to a fact finder, because a fact finder, this crime, as you said, is just so not natural, right? It's just not, this is just so beyond what typical domestic violence may look like, that it's going to be really hard for the defense to say, oh, he snapped in the moment. Life just became too much for him and he just snapped. That's not going to work. The defense really needs to put forth something that a fact finder could hang their hat on and say, okay, he really truly was not in his right mind and did not understand what he was doing or was not in control of his own actions at that point. That's a tall order under the best of circumstances. It's going to be, I think, virtually impossible for the defense to be successful on that kind of theory in this case with these facts.
Now, this happened way back in February. He was arrested then, and that's around the time that investigators determined the murder happened. But the reason we're talking about this case today is because just this week, he had appealed for release, but that was denied. And I know there are differences between United States law and Switzerland law, but it did come down to a judge deciding we're either going to let him out or not, and that was denied. Do you think that was the right move?
Absolutely. Absolutely. The nature of the crime, the charges against him are so significant, so horrific. I'm assuming the standard in Switzerland is similar to here. Is there a danger? Is there an existence of a danger factor to society, to other people around him? Is there a risk of flight? All of those factors are definitely present here. So absolutely the right decision to continue to hold him.
The couple shared 2 daughters together, and right now it's unclear who gained custody of the children after Thomas's arrest. Reporting for Law&Crime, I'm Gillespie.